Hi guys, it's Frankie from Frankie Tech. Good to see you guys again. And today I have my comparison between the Redmi X Pro, the K30 Ultra, and the K30 Pro. Now I've had this K30 Ultra just for a day, guys, and let me tell you, it is an incredible device. And there's so much about this phone that really puts the pressure on what I consider the value champ of 2020 and the affordable flagship champ of 2020. So let's go down the list here of some of the key specs between these phones. And if you did want to see more comparisons between these three incredible devices, do let me know. But anyways, let's get started. So talking about design, we have a 9mm device versus 9.1 versus 8.9. So all of these phones are very similar in terms of thickness, and in terms of weight, they are not far off as well. 208 grams for the Redmi X Pro, 213 for the K30 Ultra, 218 for the K30 Pro Zoom Edition. Now just look at the backs of these phones. They're absolutely stunning, but there's one that I think is the most stunning of all. This K30 Ultra is just looking absolutely beautiful. And while it is a glossy back, I do love the gradient look of this Ultra, but in terms of actual feel in the hand, I still think the K30 Pro in this gorgeous matte purple still is the champ. And you can see here from the back, very similar camera cutout on the Ultra versus on the Pro, but the Redmi X Pro adopts the more rectangular camera cutout. Still quad cameras on all these phones on the back. And here you see the display difference between the Redmi X Pro and the K30 Ultra, both using AMOLED panels. But looking at the bottom, you can see clearly a much larger bezel here on the X Pro. And on the top as well, you see the notch here on the X Pro. I've gotten used to this very small teardrop notch, but there's no denying it just looks so much more modern here on the K30 Ultra. Also, in terms of build, you can see a matte plastic versus this glossy aluminum edge with the antenna bands. You can definitely tell it's an aluminum frame with bottom firing speakers, USB-C, but there is a 3.5mm headphone jack on the Redmi X Pro. That's the major win, I think, of this phone and of the regular K30 Pro, which also has a 3.5mm headphone jack. All in all, guys, the design of these two phones is just far superior than the one on the Redmi X Pro, and I pretty much give it a tie. You're going to have to choose, though, between this amazing, gorgeous color on the Ultra versus this matte textured finish if you pick up the purple on the Redmi K30 Pro. And in terms of display, 6.57 versus 6.67 versus 6.67. AMOLED across the board, but this is where the Ultra truly shines. 60 Hz, 60 Hz, 120 Hz. And here you see it, neither of these phones even have the option to change refresh rate. While here on the K30 Ultra, that option is very clear. 120 Hz will give you better quality, but you can always switch down to 60 Hz to save battery life. Now, I'm obviously going to be testing out the battery life on 120 Hz, but let me tell you guys, you immediately notice this difference. And I'm shooting here at 4K 60. You may not notice it too much, but it is there, guys, and it makes for a huge difference. The single reason you would want to pick up this phone is because of this refresh rate. And given the fact that the rest of the display qualities of these phones are very similar, both between the Redmi K30 Pro and the Redmi X Pro, then the only real difference is this incredible refresh rate, which, let me tell you guys, is worth the money. Especially at this price point, there's no other phone that is offering this spec, and I think the K30 Ultra takes it here in the display round, hands down. And now with a performance preview here with the Dimensity 820 versus the 1000 Plus versus the Snapdragon 865. And you can see the Antutu scores across the board. Now I've actually run Antutu here on the K30 Ultra a number of times trying to get it into that score range that was advertised. Right now I've only gotten it as high as 493,000. I have not broken 500,000 on this phone yet. Now this could be due to some overclocking program or something of the like, but right now on version 8.4.3, which is the latest version, I think, I am getting this score on the Redmi K30 Ultra. But obviously this is an initial comparison, so I will continue to test out and see if this phone can finally break the 500,000 range, because right now we see the K30 Pro is just dominating these other two phones in terms of performance. But when you think about the price point this phone is coming in, you're getting better than last year's flagship performance in this phone. And I still think even at this score, it is a very impressive one considering the price of this phone. Here you see the Androbench 5 benchmarks for sequential read, random write, and SQLite, and you can tell that there is a big gulf here between sequential read and write. But look at these lower results here, and they are surprising. We see higher scores here on the K30 Ultra over the K30 Pro, but even more surprising, we saw higher scores here on the Redmi 10X Pro. Now keep in mind that these phones are using UFS 2.1, while this K30 Pro Zoom Edition is using UFS 3.1. So pretty incredible result here between these phones, and really proves to you that in terms of storage capabilities, these two phones are punching well above their weight next to something like the K30 Pro. And talking about battery life, we have a 4,520 versus 4,500 versus 4,700 milliampere capacities. Now currently GSAM is showing me a calculated screen on time of around 6 hours and 26 minutes for this K30 Ultra. And so far since yesterday, the battery life has been pretty good on 120 Hz. I have noticed it going down a little bit faster maybe than I would on something like the K30 Pro, but that is expected given the refresh rate of this phone. And now let's face it guys, both of these phones are battery champs at 60 Hz. So my question isn't to compare this phone at 60 Hz to make it a level playing field. You're gonna buy this K30 Ultra because you're gonna run it at 120 Hz. What's the point of running this phone at 60 Hz just to say that its battery was in line with these other phones? So more importantly to me is to run this phone at 120 Hz and really see what the battery life is like. So stay tuned guys for my full battery comparison between this K30 Ultra and these two other phones, and heck, I may throw some other phones in there as well and make it an epic battery drain test once again. And here we go with the audio speaker test. Single bottom firing speaker on both the Redmi 10X Pro and the K30 Pro, but we have dual stereo speakers here on the K30 Ultra. But let me turn the mic around and let's have a listen. That was a very impressive test here for the K30 Ultra, and you know the K30 Pro has one of the best single bottom firing speakers on any phone, and the Redmi 10X Pro does a solid job as well, but there's something about having dual speakers on a device that just make for a more immersive audio experience, and that's exactly what I've experienced here on this K30 Ultra. The bottom firing speaker is not as loud in my opinion as the one on the K30 Pro, but once you couple it with a stereo speaker, you just get a more immersive and just a more pleasing sound from this phone. And so I can say it now, the K30 Ultra wins this audio test next to the Redmi 10X Pro and the K30 Pro. And like I mentioned before guys, an initial comparison, but for now let's talk the specs differences between these phones. For primary cameras we have the OmniVision OV48B, and yesterday I did state that this K30 Ultra was using the same sensor as the K30 Pro. It's actually using the very new Sony IMX682. Now I haven't seen this sensor used, but it does remind me of a similar thing that Xiaomi did when they released the K20 and the K20 Pro last year. They released the K20 Pro with an IMX586 and released the K20 with an IMX582. And the difference between those two sensors wasn't that large in my opinion, but it will be interesting to see how the 682 compares with the 686 in my testing. And in terms of additional cameras, I think this is where the K30 Ultra actually suffers the most, because it does have a 13 megapixel ultra wide camera, but the rest of the cameras are a 5 megapixel macro and a 2 megapixel depth sensor. And one thing that the 10X Pro and the K30 Pro have as an advantage is 8 megapixel telephoto cameras, both with OIS and 3 times optical capability. If telephoto and optical zoom are important to you, then I think these two phones are still bringing a lot to the table. And in terms of video, the K30 Pro, just by the sheer prowess of the 865, is able to record 4K 60 FPS and 8K video recording out of the box. The K30 Ultra is unable to do so. And on the front, we have 20 megapixel cameras on board, including those pop-up selfie cameras you can see here on the K30 Ultra and the K30 Pro. Stay tuned for the full camera comparison between these three phones. So that's it, guys, for my initial comparison between the Redmi 10X Pro, the K30 Ultra, and the Redmi K30 Pro. And I think each of these phones still brings something amazing to the table. And I actually thought the moment I picked up this K30 Ultra that I could easily just dispense away with these two other phones. But that is not the case. There are a number of things about both of these other phones that I actually do like quite a lot. But when you're talking about the overall package of these phones, it is becoming very clear that at that starting price of 1,999 RMB, there's very little that this K30 Ultra is getting wrong. And anyone who says that sacrifices are being made on this phone, considering the price point, are missing the point of this phone. If you're just comparing this phone to flagship phones, then yes, you will find compromises, but that is not what Xiaomi does. And we've seen that time and time again with the K30 Pro and the Redmi 10X Pro. This phone needed to make sacrifices in terms of build quality and including a notch and maybe larger bezels to reach those lower level price points of 1,600 RMB for the regular version and 2,300 for the Pro version. And meanwhile, the K30 Pro needed to make biggest sacrifices, which was not including any higher refresh rate on a phone that I think became a deal breaker for a lot of people who were considering this option. Now Xiaomi is making a different series of decisions with this K30 Pro. And while some may see the different processor here, Dimensity 1000 Plus, the slightly lower storage, and the lack of telephoto cameras, let's say, on the back as negatives, this is probably the most balanced option of these three phones. And once you add the 120 Hz refresh rate, it becomes one of the most incredible deals of any phone you can get in 2020. But hit me up in the comments. Which of these phones would you pick up? The Redmi 10X Pro, the K30 Ultra, or would you go with the K30 Pro, Poco F2 Pro in this case? And which, after watching this initial comparison, do you think is the most well-rounded phone of these three? And that's it for this video. If you liked it, give me that thumbs up. And if you love the content of Frankie Tech, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon for future updates. And stay tuned, guys. We're going to be doing a lot of great videos with these three phones, camera comparisons, battery tests. And if you did want to see some speed tests between these phones as well, do let me know. I'll be happy to do them. But that's it for this one. And this is where I leave you by saying, this is Frankie Tech signing off. Have a good one.